Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, and thank you for joining us. My name is Hazim Al-Momani. I'm a consultant bariatric surgeon from Abu Dhabi, the United Arab Emirates, and it brings me the greatest of pleasures to welcome you to our Ifso Journal Club. This month, we are privileged to have with us our dearest colleague from London, Dr. Chetan Palmer. Dr. Chetan will be discussing with us his recently published manuscript in obesity surgery, talking about an up-to-date systematic scoping review of esophageal and gastric cancer following metabolic and bariatric surgery. Dr. Palmer is the head of surgery, a consultant general and bariatric surgeon working in Whittington Health NHS Trust. Dr. Palmer, thank you very much for joining us this afternoon. All right, let's get the show running. Before we start, I've got a couple of poll questions to our audience. I'll be most grateful if you can kindly all take the time to answer the questions. The first question is, do you routinely perform upper GI endoscopy prior to bariatric and metabolic surgery in your practice? Say yes, no question. Chetan, what's the practice in your unit?
Thank you, first of all, for this kind invitation. It's a pleasure and honor to be here. I think there are some internet issues, so please prompt me if you cannot hear me or see me.
Will do.
No issue when we try it out. Coming to your question, Hazim, we do preoperative endoscopy on all of our patients, regardless of symptoms or no symptoms preoperatively. Postoperatively, we do not have the resource or the facility to do it. Postoperatively, we only do endoscopies, upper GI endoscopies, if the patient has any symptoms.
And Chetan, do you do that? How long before the surgery? Is it within like a couple of weeks, couple of months at the time of admission?
Sorry, I am losing your voice. So
my question is how soon before the operations do you perform your endoscopy on your cases?
So basically, we have a structured pathway where the patient starts with all the investigations, and it's around the 6 months or so. And in that, we tend to do it a few months ago, which could vary from 6 months to just pre-op. But normally, I would say around 6 months, because they have the endoscopy, then go through the education session, and then they see us in clinic, and then based on all the investigation, it gives us an opportunity to discuss what operations we would do. So yeah, we do it a bit earlier.
Right. Well, let's see how. Right. So the majority of our attendees so far seems to follow a similar practice to yours. About 82% do perform routine upper GI endoscopy prior to bariatric and metabolic surgery. All right, let's move on to the second question, please. Now, the second question is to do with the routine performance of upper GI endoscopy following bariatric and metabolic surgery. I mean, you've already answered this question, Chetan, and may I ask, how do you justify performing the endoscopy preoperatively and you don't routinely perform it postoperatively, especially that nowadays Ifso had come up with a position statement recommending the performance of upper GI endoscopy routinely following bariatric and metabolic surgery?
So as you know, in an ideal world, yes, I would like to do preoperatively and postoperatively on everyone. Again, postoperatively, the question is, when would you do 1 year, 2 year, 3 year, 5 year? I think that's $1 million question. Plus, as I mentioned, yes, ideally I would like to do it, but do we have the resources? Do we have the facility to do that? Plus, not just that, even in an asymptomatic patients, when you ask them to come for endoscopy, it's not easy to convince them to just come for a routine postoperative endoscopy as well. So there are different challenges, as you know. If the patients, even with follow-up, just get endoscopy, just routine follow-up, we struggle for 100% follow-up.
Agree. Well, again, I think the audience seem to follow your practice. Around 3/4 of our attendees do not offer routine postoperative upper GI endoscopy following bariatric and metabolic surgery. Okay, well, Well, there'll be another question towards the end of today's journal club. Let's see if Jitin can convince you to change your practice and whether he can shed more light about the findings with regards to the esophageal gastric cancer following bariatric and metabolic surgery. Jitin, I won't interrupt you any further. The mic is yours. Please share with us your findings from your recently published paper.
Thank you very much, and I'm going to start sharing my. Yeah, can you see my screen?
Yes, we can see it and we can hear you very well, Jitin.
Thank you very much. First of all, thank you, Ifso, for this kind invitation. It's a pleasure and honor. Thank you, obesity surgery team, as well, for accepting our publication, and also along with that, selecting it as a article for Journal Club as well. It's an honor and pleasure. I think we already talked. I'm Chetan Parmar. I'm one of the bariatric consultants in London, and I'm here today to talk about our most recently published systematic review scoping review of literature of 324 cases. At this opportunity, I would also like to thank my co-author, Zach Powell, who has been amazing contribution to this article. I think just to highlight that obesity surgery impact factor, which was around 3.7 a year or so ago, has now gone to over 4.12. So congratulations for that. And we all know that it's an official journal of the Ifso. So why did we do this paper in the first place? I think I would start highlighting a couple of papers, what interested us in doing this study. This paper, if you look at body mass index and risk of 22 specific cancers from 5.2 million patients from people from UK, if you look, each 5 increase in BMI was roughly associated with cancers of the uterus. I think we all kind of hear and listen and see this literature off and on. Also, if you look at this paper, it concluded that the BMI was positive associated with liver, colon, ovary, and postmenopausal breast cancer. But as you can see, not many papers talk about esophageal or gastric cancer. Similar paper of nearly 30,000 patients, which showed, unsurprisingly, that at 10 years, 2.9 patients in the bariatric surgery group compared to 4.9 patients in the non-surgery group had chance of cancer. When it comes to mortality, it was 0.8% in the bariatric surgery group and 1.4% in the non-surgical control group. So they concluded that among adults with obesity, bariatric surgery compared with no surgery was associated with a as well. So as you can see, they talk of different cancers, up to 22 cancers. But when you go in detail, esophagus and gastric cancers are not much talked of. Now let's see what the published literature about esophageal-gastric cancer is. Well, we all know that 1.5 million plus new cases of OG cancers are diagnosed globally every year. However, bariatric surgery has been shown for reduction in incidence of many cancers, and as I mentioned, the mechanism of that is still not understood and it's limited. Also, the impact of bariatric cancer on EG cancer has not fully been characterized because there's limited literature out there. Plus, we all know diagnosis of EG cancer is often delayed in this cohort of patients, mainly because of the anatomical rearrangement. As we know, after Roux-en-Y gastric bypass or one anastomosis gastric bypass, the gastric remnant becomes inaccessible. Also, symptoms of iron deficiency anemia, ferritin problems, dysphagia, reflux, or even weight loss. We all contribute that to our bariatric surgery and actually don't put it to cancer. So I think that's why it can get overlooked. Nowadays, sleeve and Barrett's are too much debated. There is a lot of studies showing now that with sleeve, the Barrett's incidence is around 12%. And they have concerns that all the sleeves are going to develop OG cancers. OAGB, I don't need to talk more. It's been looked under a microscope since it has started. Reflux and cancer are strongly considered to be associated with this operation, and it took a while for the Ifso and ASMBS to recognize this operation. And as per our systematic review as well, the incidence is only 4% of reflux, but as I say, it's been really, really scrutinized. Then comes this scenario. Let us say somebody publishes some esophageal cancer after sleeve gastrectomy. Bang, comes another article from the proponents of sleeve saying, no, that doesn't happen. It happens in all operation. Then comes another rebuttal, and that argument goes on in the literature as well. Similar for OAGB, MGB as well. So let us say a cancer of OAGB, MGB on esophageal or gastric is published. Bang, the proponents of the OAGB, MGB operation publish their counter rebuttal as well. So I think that kind of silent discussion is going on, and that actually led us to this paper, which we published, where we went out and collected all the OG cancers from around the world as much as possible, and we found 170 cases, which is till date now the largest collection of retrospective OG cancers after bariatric surgery. So when we were doing this study, that's where the idea of this operation came in, and we thought of this paper came in, and we thought, okay, let's do an updated overview of the occurrence, diagnosis, treatment, and outcomes of OG cancers after bariatric surgery. We also wanted to see whether we can characterize esophageal or gastric cancers after bariatric surgery and understand the challenges in their diagnosis and management. And the main point what we wanted to know was, should we really be concerned of OG cancer after bariatric surgery, and wanted to answer that question. So how did we go around doing it? I think like all systematic reviews and scoping reviews, we selected the articles, any patients or any articles which mention diagnosis of primary esophageal, OG junctional, gastric pouch, even gastric remnant malignancy after bariatric surgery were eligible for this study. We didn't put any time lag. So irrespective of time lag between the bariatric procedure and subsequent diagnosis, we included all studies. All databases were looked for. We were 2 co-authors there, and any disagreement the scoping review. Now, how does a scoping review differ from a systematic review? Well, it's still a comprehensive as a systematic review, but it gives a bit of more broader search. It will also produce more results than a systematic review. A systematic review focuses on mainly trying to obtain an answer, whereas scoping review maps the relevant literature in a complete field of interest. Also, a scoping review describes the main findings rather than analyzing and trying to draw literature and all we decided to do for this study. So what did we find here? Results. Search one, that 49 studies is only we try to look at systematic reviews looking at this problem. And then we did another search where we tried to look at all the OG cancer reports after bariatric surgery in literature. And as you can see, we found thousands of patients here. As mentioned earlier, we only wanted the primary OG cancers. So letter to editors, reviews, just narratives were all excluded. And finally, we ended up with around 52 papers for analysis of this article. This is the list of all the articles published till date. It's a bit busy slide, but mainly I wanted to highlight that it starts from 1991, 1996, all the way to 2022. So all papers which are published till date were included in our review. So what did we find? Let's look at the patient characteristics. So 324 patients were eligible to be included in this systematic review. As expected, more females compared to more males, 42% females, 34% males. Mean age of around 55 years in this group. Mean weight at primary bariatric surgery was 140 kilos. Interestingly, not all papers mentioned BMI, so we couldn't really say what BMI they were. Mean weight at the cancer diagnosis was around 113 kilos. Only 58 patients were documented in this literature to have GERD. Rest data was not available. Smoking, 55 patients, there was documentation that they had smoking. Similar, only 13% patient had documentation of alcohol, or at least given quantity or more details of alcohol intake as well. Now comes the interesting bit. So what did we find? Out of the 324 Roux-en-Y gastric bypass, 133 patients had OG cancers. Sleeve, which everybody is worried about with Barrett's and things, only 58, and as we know, it's the most common performed operation. Gastric band, GB stands for gastric band here, 97 patients. VBG is 14. MGB, OAGB, what we talk of, only 7 patients. If you look in the graph, it gives you a breakup of the esophagus, stomach, gastric pouch, and G junction as well. Also worth noting, the gastric remnants here as well were included for completion's sake. We know that's not really associated to that, but I think we wanted to highlight the issue here. So Roux-en-Y 24. And if you look at the OAGB, MGB column, out of the 7, actually 3 are in the gastric remnants, so only 4 in either the gastric pouch or at the OG junction along with this operation. So there were few BPDs, there were around 15 other, and again, those are either BPD, gastric balloon, single anastomosis loop duodenojejunal bypass, or duodenal switch, but nothing screaming to be worried about. Let's look at the histological type of the cancers here. Not surprisingly, majority were adenocarcinoma, but we also got few of signet cell carcinomas, few squamous cell carcinomas. We also included gastrointestinal stromal tumors. We also included neuroendocrine tumors, and we also managed to find some small cell carcinomas in this study. Talking of TNM classification, as you can see, the T and the node, nothing worrying or exciting there. But if you look at the M, the metastasis, that's probably more of an issue, that by the time these patients were diagnosed, up to 24% of the patient already had metastasis when the cancer diagnosis was made. It seems like a lot here. And therefore, that reflects on the treatment plan, which is the table 4. If you look, only 15 had some endoscopic intervention. If you look at the surgery, gastrectomy, subtotal esophagectomy, nearly 80 to 90 of those. A couple had colonic interposition, I assume with sleeves. They didn't specify that. But what is interesting is that 44 patients directly ended up needing palliative therapy after this, which kind of reflects that, when you have metastasis, probably that's what those patients were having. This is most important finding here, mean time from the bariatric metabolic surgery to the diagnosis of cancer. What we found in this review of 324 patients was it was around 62 months, which reflects as around 5.2 years plus or minus 2.7 years. Also, around 38% died during the course of the disease, as mentioned in the literature as well. So, which is a significant number, I would say. Coming to discussion, ideally, I would have loved to talk about the causative factors which we normally associate with the OG cancers, but unfortunately, the variables are not well described in literature here, like smoking, alcohol, H. pylori, not mentioned. And probably I would take this opportunity to highlight to people that in future, if anybody publishes anything, please provide as much detail as possible. So at least in next 10 years, 20 years, we get to learn more from where the problem lies. Coming back to the time lag from BMS to diagnosis of cancer, as I mentioned in this review, it was around 5.25 years. But if you look at that OGMO study, which had 170 patients, what we found was, because we were able to do this breakdown there, which reflects in this paper, that 5.9 years was the diagnosis of cancer after sleeve, compared to 9.4 after Roux-en-Y, and compared to 10.5 after bands. So that's the whole mischief happens around 5 to 10 years time. As mentioned earlier, OAGB is very heavily scrutinized for OG cancer, but out there it's not published much, and I doubt that people would struggle to find OG cancer or publish it, because, as I say, journals are quite keen to take these patients and publish. So only 4 cases of OG cancer diagnosed till date. And as we all know, OGB was started being performed in 1997 and then published in 2001. And by 2005, with the modification to OGB, there are now thousands and thousands on operation. And we know from the Ifso registry as well, that is the 3rd most common operation now in the world. So yes, if there were cancers, we would be picking them somewhere. And how this helps with the Ifso position statement, I think we vaguely said during the poll. Ifso position statement mentions that we should be doing routine post-operative endoscopy at 1 year, and then every 2 years and 3 years, mainly after refluxogenic operations like sleeve and OAGB. So this paper kind of helps us with that. Now, as I mentioned, 24% of this patient had distant metastasis at presentation, and it seemed like a lot. So we went and looked at the literature. And what is interesting to note here is that when we look at literature in non-obese patients, the rate of distant metastasis for esophageal cancer as initial diagnosis range up to 42%. And that for stomach cancer is 35%. So actually, this 24% is less than what is published out there for non-obese patients. I assume for obese patients, patients with obesity, it would even be higher. So do you think this is lower in patients who would have bariatric surgery? Well, it kind of fits in where everyone else publishes literature that bariatric surgery reduces chances of cancer. So it kind of reflects that. Plus, I don't know whether because we tend to follow these patients up regularly, and also if there are any issues, we tend to have a lower threshold for investigating as well, including OGD and CT scan. Maybe that's why we are picking up some patients earlier. Point to ponder. 37% of the patient died during course of treatment, which we mentioned. But having said that, we need to overall interpret these results with caution, because one, when you put all this data together, this is a multinational cohort where patients have different lifestyle, Eastern, Western, Middle Eastern, different cultures, different eating habits, different smoking habits, even smoking, tobacco, filtered cigarette. There are different types of smoking habits as well. So I think those things are not taken into consideration when this comes. Obviously, our paper has a lot of limitations. It's a retrospective study. And as I mentioned, the variables which I would have loved to analyze, like smoking, alcohol, H. pylori, were not mentioned enough for us to do any meaningful conclusion. We also cannot give you what is the risk with this OG cancer after bariatric surgery, mainly divided into the procedure, because it is a retrospective study. Also publication bias, because we know not case reports are not easily publishable. So there might be a lot of cancers out there and people are just not publishing those case reports, including obesity surgery. They don't publish case reports, and we don't have a denominator. For example, the Ifso registry, as far as I remember from 2013, if you look at the 3rd Ifso registry report, there were only around 90,000 operations recorded. Be missing out there as well. So that's something to look at. Strengths, I think even in spite of all these limitations, I would say this is a very strong study, because it contributes significantly to a very limited body of literature on this very difficult topic. This kind of publication will help us develop endoscopy surveillance guidelines in future, and also help us plan. My friends, I would say, well, this is the most up-to-date review of OG cancers after bariatric surgery. Interesting to note that the mean time gap after bariatric surgery and the diagnosis of cancer was around 5.2 years. Unsurprisingly, 87% were adenocarcinomas. Overall mortality was high. And this strongly highlights the need of very robust publications, and that would people struggle to publish. So I think this highlights more than the need of national and international databases or registries where people can even submit their OG cancers after bariatric surgery. And it also helps us come to guidelines to say what post-operative surveillance endoscopy timing should be ideal. Thank you very much.
Chetan, thank you very much. It's a very, very interesting chat. To all our attendees, may I please ask you to type in your questions into the chat box so we can share them with Chetan here and learn from his experience. Chetan, if you don't mind, I'll get the ball rolling. It's my question to you. You have kindly explained to us the difference between a scoping review and a systematic review. May I please ask, why did you opt for a scoping review in this manuscript rather than a systematic one, please?
Yeah, so I think as I mentioned in the third or fourth slide in the methodology, systematic review gives you, so scoping review basically is more broader than a systematic review. There were already a couple of systematic reviews published related to this. So one, if you look at Scozzari from before 2012, I think, and then there's another one from Musella in 2018. So we also wanted to try and include those ones. Plus, this is a very broad topic. So first, we wanted to understand how much of a problem it is in the community, rather than try and give conclusions and draw protocols. And I think that is the main difference between it. Yes, it gives more data than systematic review. It is more broader and covers the topic widely.
Fair enough. And you've led me into my second question, is that how big of a problem you think this is, Chetan? You've touched on this in your paper where you talked about a big number of patients are probably diagnosed in other facilities, so the initial operating surgeon is not aware of their disease. We've got the concept of medical tourism, where people travel abroad to have their surgeries in other countries and then they fly to other places. In my part of the world, bariatric surgery is a bit of a taboo. A lot of patients would not want to talk about it. How much of a problem you believe this is? Because as you've said, there are lots of conflicting data, a lot of conflicting discussions about cancer and bariatric surgery.
That's a very interesting question, Hazim, and I think that was the original question why we started doing this study in the first place as well. Because as I highlighted the paper about sleeve and Barrett's and OAGB, there is so much of talk saying, oh, we should not be doing sleeves now because we have concerns of Barrett's. We need to consent patient about Barrett's and cancer. I don't think we all tend to do that yet. Same thing with OAGB, like it should not be done because it will all cause cancers. Having said that and having looked at, I don't see that there are OG cancers just popping out like mushrooms everywhere. I don't know. I'm sure in a small country like, for example, UK.
Well, it seems that we've lost Chetan there for a minute. I'm sure he's been having problems with his because he's connecting from his hospital internet. One of the significant points that Chetan had raised, which raised alarm bells for me, to be honest, in his publication, is a lot of these. I'm sorry, Chetan, we've lost you for a minute.
I can hear you, but the camera for all of a sudden stopped.
Yeah, well, I would suggest that you probably try turning off your camera. That might improve the signal a bit. Whenever you lose you, just switch it off. So you were just telling us, Chetan, about with regard to the incidence of esophageal gastric cancer in the UK?
Yeah, it just automatically switched off, sorry.
It's all right. I think it does that just to improve the signal.
Sorry, apologies. This doesn't tend.
It's all right. If you don't mind me, Chetan, I was going to highlight a very important point that you guys have touched on in your paper. And it's quite an alarming one. And that you've talked about the delay in the detection of esophageal gastric cancer following bariatric surgery, because the symptomatology of these two types of cancer are very common in people who have undergone this surgery in the past, meaning a lot of these patients are expected to lose weight. A lot of these patients can have vomiting. A lot of these patients are at risk of iron deficiency anemia. And I probably could be on the receiving end of a patient coming to my clinic complaining of these symptoms, and I brush him or brush her off as, yes, this is expected after their surgery. So do you believe that we should be more vigilant and be more careful in these cases? And that takes us back to the question, do you believe that the kind of patients that we're operating on are at a higher risk of developing these cancers in comparison to the general population, or no?
I think as we know, obesity in itself, what we tend to forget is that obesity in itself, for example, central obesity itself is a risk factor for OG cancer, because it is predisposing nearly 40 to 50% of the patient with obesity develop GERD symptoms as well. So I think we forget that underlying factor, that itself is a risk factor for cancer. Now you are doing bariatric surgery. So overall, looking at all the literature, I still think that we are actually reducing the incidence of OG cancer in this cohort of the patients overall. So I think that's one thing. Two, we do tend to be quite vigilant, I would say, in the post-op periods, looking for, booking diagnostic tests like OGDs and CT scans. I don't think we need to go out of the way, but yes, I think we need to recognize the symptoms, that if there is significant anemia, if in a compliant patient, because another compliance is a big issue. I don't know how's your experience, but people and patients do struggle to take the multivitamins, calciums, irons, and we really need to remind them. So first of all, we always think of compliance. And I think if compliance is fine and everything else is fine and they still persist with that, I think we should have a low threshold for doing endoscopies, even colonoscopies and CT scan in this cohort of the patient. But I think most importantly, what I find from this paper is this would help us. Look, ideally, I mentioned earlier as well that we would want to do OGDs in 2 years, 3 years. But if not, at least let's start doing OGD at 4 or 5 years, and then see what's happening. Slowly go to 1 year, 2 year, 3 year. If you tell me that, okay, do 1, 2, 3, 4 every yearly, it's just physically not possible. So I think we need to, this kind of highlights.
Agree. Well, I was going to touch on that, to be honest, because looking at the results of your publication and the OGMOS paper, I don't know, in my opinion, it makes more sense, as you've kindly mentioned, that to consider the endoscopy after an interval. The first 2, 3, perhaps 4 years, the risks of cancer are less. Obviously, I assume when the guidelines or the position statement was placed, they were thinking of reflux as a precursor. But now when we look at the final outcome, which is a cancer, the incidence of that happens after 5 years. You talked about 5 years plus, and you've kindly demonstrated it quite nicely in your OGMOS paper, where you talked about it being up to 10 years after a Roux-en-Y gastric bypass. Because to be honest, Chitin, for me, I've always believed or thought that a bypass is in a way an anti-reflux surgery, and on the long term would reduce the risk of Barrett's, consequently cancer. But now you're telling me that in your paper, the majority of cases are cases of Roux-en-Y gastric bypass.
Yeah, well, I think, but you have to also remember that sleeve and Roux-en-Y were and are still the most common done operations. And I think, again, highlighting the fact that if we have done an OGD and we were happy that the esophagus and stomach was fine, then I don't think we should start worrying about cancer in 1, 2, 3 years, because that's the natural course of the disease itself, that it won't just, anybody tells me cancer in a year, probably I would first think that they probably just missed the cancer to begin with, rather than a cancer in 1 year after bariatric surgery. Would you agree with me, Hazim, on that?
I fully agree. I fully agree with you, Chitin. Chitin, I've got a question from, can you hear me, Chitin? Chitin, can you hear me?
I can hear you, but since you're
the question is to do. Can you hear me? Chitin, in your talk. Hello?
Yeah, well, I can see you, but
can you hear me?
For some reason, sorry, sincere apologies, guys.
That's all right, sir.
Yeah, blame it on the NHS internet.
That's all right. It's the NHS internet, no problem. Chitin, in your talk, you've used your paper as a stepping stone towards further research projects in the future. And you raised the question is, if we are to do the same paper in 10 years, do you think the distribution of cancer amongst metabolic and bariatric surgery listed will be different? Meaning that everyone seems to be reluctant in a lot of countries to adopt the one anastomosis gastric bypass, believing that it might increase the incidence of future cancer in the future because of bile reflux. But you have kindly demonstrated in both your publications, the Ogmos paper and this paper, the Roux-en-Y gastric bypass risk is actually quite high. Do you think if we do the same paper in about 10 years, this might be different or no?
Can you see me?
I can hear you. What I would suggest, if you're using your phone,
I was trying to join in via my phone just to see whether that helps.
Yeah, just mute the mic on your laptop or desktop.
Yeah, no, I was just trying to see whether I could join via the phone to make life easier. Fine, no. So coming to your question, I don't think it would so much of a difference, Azim. I think metabolic surgery, the whole concept is different. I don't think just that sleeves or Roux-en-Ys would change the whole distribution and all of a sudden we'll start finding more. No, I think what might happen is because we will be doing more operations, or because we are now becoming more aware of this, we might be diagnosing it more. And that's what might reflect all of a sudden that, oh, there has been a bit of increase in the number, but that might not be because of that. It might just be because of our awareness, our lower threshold for investigating, and people trying to publish those data. So even since the Ogmos, I can tell you that nearly there are 5-6 people who have contacted me saying, oh, we have now found the cancer. Can you please, include it somewhere? So I think it is just us raising the awareness. And I think that is where the national registries come in handy, that they should be able to just submit it somewhere nationally.
Great.
So that we just in 10 years time would have a productive, result or analysis.
All right, I've got a few questions from our audience, please, Chitin, if you don't mind. There's an interesting one. Now, unfortunately, I don't have the name of the guest who's raising this question. Do you think that bariatric surgeons should consider further the role of gastric pre-malignant lesions and pathologies, for example, like chronic atrophic gastritis or intestinal metaplasia, when indicating which bariatric surgery procedure they should recommend for their patients?
Definitely, that's a very good question, whoever asked it. And I think this is where the role of MDT comes in handy. You see, and that is where preoperative endoscopy comes in handy, because unless you do preoperative endoscopy, you just don't have this diagnosis. And I would strongly suggest that, yes, when you have any doubt of any pre-malignant lesions, that there should be other options to consider. And also, for example, now, we have an amazing option of pharmacotherapy. So let us say this is a low BMI patient. Pharmacotherapy is one of the option. Again, ESG is quite becoming popular, the role of that. Plus, in those patients, I would rather do an operation where I'm able to then do a surveillance afterward as well of the stomach, rather than a bypass where I will not be able to see the, see the remnant at all. So yes, I think they should definitely be discussed in MDT, and that thing should be talked with the patient as well. I think that should become a part of the counseling with the patient, that look, these are your advantages, these are your disadvantages. If you have, let us say, a Barrett's or a low grade, at what years it will turn into cancer, or a metaplasia at 10 years, 12, 20 years. But if you have uncontrollable diabetes and you are suffering from obesity, I think that's what discussion should happen with the patient, that yes, you will have the benefits of bariatric surgery in these 10 years, but then we need to be aware of that. And those would be the cohort where you should, along with that, counsel and kind of have an agreement with the patient that we need your promise for a long-term surveillance as well.
I agree. And I think, as you say, this is where the informed consent comes into play and adequate follow-up. Agree. I would like to thank Dr. Xxxvi for raising this question. I've just received his name. Thank you very much. It's a very nice question. Dr. Xxxvi is joining us from Spain. I've got another question, and they talk about the point that we've raised. A gentleman or the lady asking us this question are telling us that they would recommend that an endoscopy should be done sooner to allow early detection. I think probably, at least for me, I probably got misunderstood. I'm full on with regard to surveillance endoscopy following bariatric surgery. But as you've mentioned, Chitin, I think they become more significant later on in the journey.
Yeah, I think again that's a very important question, and that is that's the dilemma which we always discuss, and and this is where this kind of studies help us. That let us say we knew that bariatric the cancers tend to happen after 5 years, so yes, we should, given a choice, we should start doing them at 3 or 4 years. But what I meant earlier was that if you have limited resources and you had to only choose between doing it at 1 year and 4 year, I would rather do it at 4 year than 1 year. 1 year only if it's a serious problem, but 4 years as a routine surveillance. That's what I would highlight.
Thank you. And sorry.
Elaborating more on that point, that would depend on the type of operation as well. So as we saw, even in the other studies that look with sleeve and all, around 6 years it was happening. With Roux-en-Y and band, it is around 10 years. So that helps in the guidelines and so.
Fair enough. Chitin, thank you. And thanks, Valerie from the Netherlands, for raising this question. I've got another question, and they talked about the nightmare, cancer in the gastric remnant, and they talk about the difficulty of diagnosing such cancers. In your review, Chitin, was there any mentioning with regard whether there was anything unique about these cases where the cancer was picked up in the remnant, how were they diagnosed, etc.?
So again, very good point. And if you look at that table, I think there were around, as far as I remember, there are around 24 in the gastric remnant in the Roux-en-Y group, and correct. I think there were around 3 in the remnant in the OAGB group. And no, unfortunately, it doesn't pick up. But what on a, again, not a very strongly correlated, or you can't make conclusion out of it. But what we did find were that the patients where the cancers were found in remnant, they had a higher proportion of metastasis. But as I say, because of the smaller number, I can't really conclude that. But I think it does make sense that by the time it becomes, let us say, a cancer in the Roux-en-Y gastric remnant, by the time it manifests itself, that would have become quite large and already spread somewhere, compared to in or an OG junction would come out as a dysphagia or some blood in vomitus or something sooner. So it makes sense.
I agree. Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Xxxvi from Germany, for this question. Chitin, the other point I wanted to discuss with you was regard age group. Have you noticed any change in the pattern of age group about with regard to the incidence of esophagogastric cancer in this cohort in comparison to the general public?
Interestingly not. If you look,
yeah.
I think it here as well, it's around 55. If you look at the other systematic reviews as well, it is around 52 to 56. So no, I think that 50 to 55, or let us say, even if you take a broader one, it's between 50 and 60. It tends to be in that age group. And normally pushing your question further, you normally tend to see them made in males. Here it was a 60-40 kind of distribution, female 60, female 40 males. But then we do a lot of bariatric surgeries in female anyway. So I think again that is that rather than the other way around.
Agree. As you say, there's a selection bias because of the population being studied. There's a question as well. Unfortunately, I don't have the name of the person asking him. What do you think is the reason for the higher incidence of esophageal gastric cancers in the sleeve gastrectomy group? This is a question from Nigeria.
Again, I don't think this paper shows that there is a higher proportion of esophageal cancer in the sleeve. I think we saw that there were 133 in the Roux-en-Y group and 58 in the sleeve group and 97 in the band. So yeah, it was less than half in the sleeve group.
Yeah.
Sleeve now is the #1 performed procedure. But having said that, I think what probably the question is trying to ask is that lag of 6 years in a sleeve compared to that 10 years lag after Roux-en-Y might be what they are focusing to. And you probably already touched that topic, Hazim, that we all think and we all consider Roux-en-Y to be the standard when it comes to non-refluxogenic operation anyway. So I think those might be one of the factors. And the other factor, what I think is as well, that in sleeves, the diagnosis of cancer would be picked up early compared to, let us say, if it was in a remnant in a Roux-en-Y. And that's where that lag, because of the heterogeneity of the data, you can't have that correlation. So I think those confounding factors have to be taken into consideration.
Fair enough,
Chetan. We do agree that sleeve has more chance of reflux compared to Roux-en-Y. So I think that reflects.
Well, as I said, Chetan, your paper has changed a lot of conceptions or ideas I've got in my mind. I mean, the more you do, the more we realize we actually don't know. We've got a lot of theories, but in practice, things are different. As you've mentioned, we've had the one anastomosis for nearly now 20 plus years. We've got the sleeve for longer. The numbers of sleeves are much higher in comparison to the others, yet the incidence in both papers you've taken part of seems to be higher with the operation which we thought is the protective one. I don't know what the results are going to be in 10 years. It'll be quite interesting. There's a sort of philosophical question I've got from Spain. They say, conceptually speaking, do you think that there's a difference between sleeve gastrectomy on the one hand and the adjustable gastric band and the vertically banded gastroplasty on the other hand regarding the hypothetical risk of reflux and Barrett esophagus and esophageal cancer? And I think it's something that you've touched on.
So sorry, I didn't get the question. So the difference between the sleeve and the band and vertical sleeve
gastrectomy with regard to reflux and increased risk of Barrett esophagus and junctional tumors, I assume.
Yeah, I think I do think that sleeve and bands you could put in the same cohort, because remember, band again is causing that restrictive and obstructive thing, and patient tends to have reflux. Plus, if you look at the cancer natural progression, repeated trauma to a place would cause problems. So I think anything which causes reflux and those would be able to contribute the same. I don't think one would be more than the other, but yeah, I think it is a bit difficult to answer. I might just be going theoretical here, and I don't want to give theoretical.
No, I think it's a clever question, and they talked about whether reflux is the same reflux after a sleeve or the band. And as you say, I don't think we've got enough science to answer it in a scientific way on this forum. Perhaps a chat around a round table could be a bit of a different discussion. This was
theoretically, it sounds that yes, in sleeve you would have more bile and gastric juice reflux in the esophagus, whereas in a band it is mainly your food and what you eat causing dysphagia and nausea feeling and that constant irritation So that is what it sounds. But as I say, I don't think I have enough read or literature about comment on that.
I think it's a very, very clever question. It'll be nice if we've had the chance to speak to Surin to see what's the logic or the thinking behind the question, but I could see the logic or the way of thinking. Okay, fair enough. Well, Chitin, it's been very, very interesting talking to you. I wish we can carry on. We're coming towards the end of our webinar, and I've got another question to our attendees to answer to, please. So if we can have the poll up. But while waiting for the poll, the question to come up. Now, this is my question to you, and I think you've touched on that. In light of the finding of this paper and the previously published OGMUS paper, will you consider offering, should obviously the resources be available and the funding, would you be considering offering routine upper GI endoscopy after bariatric and metabolic surgery? Chitin?
For me, I think yes, but I would not do it in 1 year or 2 years. I would actually start doing it at 3 years to begin with, and then take it from there. So I would do a 3-year and a 5-year one. And remember, as I mentioned again, it's the compliance issue as well. So I would offer them, the patients, both those options, and I would stress on 3 years.
Right. And I would assume you would have given this answer in light of the fact that you are offering routine upper GI endoscopies as well.
In pre-op, yes, not post-op.
Yes. All right. Well, let's see what the results would show. Well, we've got nearly a consensus that nearly everyone believes that routine upper GI endoscopy should be performed following bariatric and metabolic surgery. All right. Well, Chitin, before we conclude, any last message, any advice? You seem to have done a lot of work into this topic, and if there's any words of wisdom that you'd like to share with us and the rest of our audience, I'll be most grateful before we conclude.
Thank you again. First of all, I would like to thank you again, Hazim, for this excellent session and excellent questions. And thank you, the audience, for engaging well as well. I think the word sounds too clever here, but I would simply say, looking at all the papers here, please publish any cancers which you see, write to your journals, write to obesity surgery as well. They are happy to accept them. And if you publish, please put all the relevant data, like what I was mentioning, smoking, alcohol, H. pylori. So then in 10 years, 20 years time, it makes more sense when we analyze this data, and then we can have more strong learning lessons out of it. So yeah, 1, publish, and 2, when you publish, please put all relevant data in there. Thank you.
Thank you, Chitin. I think you could not have said it in any better way. You've touched on this earlier and you brought it up again. So obviously, you do believe that there is a matter here that needs further discussion and further looking into. It's probably underreported. You've highlighted the importance of registries, because a lot of the patients that we operate on, they end up being seen somewhere else to go and see an esophageal gastric surgeon rather than a bariatric surgeon. And I think reporting these cases is of a great value. I mean, loads of questions unanswered and a few answered, but that's the way things are with an evolving science. Well, to all of you, Chitin, Ifso Secretariat, for all their kind support and for supporting us in the background. Thank you all very much. To all our audience, you've been superb. The questions have been stimulating.
Before I finish, I wanted to invite you on behalf of Ifso for the Napoli 2023 conference. Note the date, August 30th to September 1st, 2023, Italy, Naples. Welcome on behalf of Ifso.
Welcome, and we look forward to seeing you there. To our audience, I'd like to remind you that should you have missed the entire discussion in today's Journal Club, there's a recording on our social media platforms, and there's a recording on our YouTube channel. Make sure to join in. Thank you, Chitin. Really appreciate your time. It's been very interesting, very exciting, and very stimulating. Thank you. Have a lovely day, all of you. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, and apologies for the internet, but thank you.
Thank you. Great. Thank you.
Have a nice day, everyone. Merry Christmas to everyone as well.
Yes, definitely. Happy festive season. Thank you. Bye.